Hi, it's Laura. Welcome back to my channel. I'm way too awkward for this. Cool. These are going to be some books that you can read if you're interested in diversifying your reading. Now, this video is in honor of Black History Month, but Black History Month should not be the only reason that you're diversifying your reading. I am also trying to make it a goal of mine to diversify my reading throughout the year. But so these are some good books to get you started. All of these books that I'm going to show you, except for one, are written by authors of color, and they also have people of color as their protagonists. Let's get started. I have 7 books and 1 honorary mention because one of the books that I have is not written by a person of color. However, it is a biography about a person of color. So this book is called All Blood Runs Red. Unfortunately, I could not find the memoir that was written by Eugene Ballard himself, who is the man on this cover, but this is all about his life. So it's not written by him. Unfortunately, it is written by 2 white guys. This is my honorable mention. So Eugene Ballard was a black man who was born in the early 1900s. He was born in Georgia. By the time he was 11, he had seen way too much racism, and he was like, I need to get out of here. And he decided he was going to move to France. So he found passage on a train and then on a boat. And he got himself to France because he was convinced that France is a magical place where race doesn't matter. So he found himself in France. While he was in France, he became a boxer. When World War I started, he was like, I want to help. I love France. He enlisted in the French army as an American citizen. He worked for a while in the infantry, and then he decided that he wanted to be a pilot. Eugene Ballard is the first black fighter pilot. After World War I ended, he stayed in France, and he was like, I love this place. He decided he wanted to box again, but he was injured really badly for the war, so he ended up becoming a promoter for boxing and a manager of a bar. And then he decided he wanted to get into business himself in a bar. He was a manager of a club for a while, and then he opened a club himself, and then he opened a second club where he just hung out with super famous people before they were famous, sometimes while they were famous. He was really good friends with Josephine Baker. Langston Hughes worked at his shop. He was good friends with Ernest Hemingway. There was a character based off of him in one of Ernest Hemingway's books. He was good friends with Louis Armstrong, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dooley Wilson. He played Sam in Casablanca. He was a good friend. The Dolly sisters, Sophie Tucker was a comedian, Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, the Prince of Wales, Fred and Adele Astaire. All of these people would come to his club just to hang out. Bricktop, Zellies, Duke Ellington. So he opened this club and was like, I'm gonna do this. He did it, and he was really successful with it. And then World War II hit, and his club was still popping. And at this point he could speak. He had been living in France for 20 years, 30 years, and he could speak French, he could speak English, he could speak German, and he could speak passable Italian. So the French government came to him and were like, hey, do you feel like being a spy? And he was like, for sure. So then he was, during World War II, he was a spy. Once it was too dangerous for him to stay and continue to spy, he decided he was gonna sign himself up for World War II as like an army man, and walked to where he could find his infantry because he was like, I'm gonna help. After the war, he came back to America. He found his 2 daughters because at this point he was a single dad. Their mom had left. They told people she died, but there's evidence to the contrary, that she didn't actually die, she just ditched. Then he came back to America, and like in America, because it was still, you know, crazy racist, he couldn't do what he had done. France loved him, and America hated him. He ended up being like an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center, which is actually where he got his last 15 minutes of fame, where America was finally like, oh my gosh, this guy's super cool, because he went on air with Dave Garroway in the Today Show and just talked about himself for 15 minutes. He brought all of his awards because he had won the highest award France gave out for a war, and all of these other awards as well. So he had the most crazy life that anybody has ever had in the history of the world. It was like the most interesting book. I finished it last night. There are a bunch of pictures in here too of like his life It's a really interesting book, would definitely recommend, but this is not an official recommendation for a person of color author because it was not written by a person of color, but it is about a person of color. So All Blood Runs Red. Now to the actual recommendations, now that I've been talking for 10 minutes. I just love that story so much. I think it's super interesting. I'm gonna start with the fiction books, and then I'm gonna go on to the romance. There's like historical fiction, and then contemporary fiction, and then science fiction, and then I have a few romance and fantasy romance. We're gonna start with Yellow Life. So obviously I did a whole video on this. This was my Once Upon a Book Club book pick for February, or maybe it was January, I don't know. I read it in February, that's when they gave it to me. It was excellent. If you want to hear more about this book, there was a reading vlog. It'll definitely be linked to the bio below. So if you want to hear more about this book, it was 5 stars. It was really, really good. This is a historical fiction book. Yellow Life by Sadeqa Johnson. It was very good, 5 stars. Next we have Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. I really liked this. This was a contemporary fiction. It was kind of about white saviorism a little bit, I think, personally. I don't know if that's right. I'm not read up enough on the topic to like absolutely guarantee. I gave it 4 stars because the ending left a little bit to be desired to me. Like I wanted to know more once we got to the end. Like I was like, excuse me, what happens next? It's such a beautiful read, and it really touches on race now. So a lot of these books are historical fiction or fiction from like the 1970s or so, and this really touches on race in the 21st century. So this was very good. Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid, 4 stars. Next we have The Kindest Lie by Nancy Johnson. So this was a Book of the Month Club book for this month. I liked this book. I have never been in the situation that our main character is in. I've never had a child and been forced to give it up. I've also never been a child and found out randomly that I was adopted. But one way or another, I kind of found myself disagreeing with all of the choices that our main character was making. And maybe I was supposed to, maybe that was part of it. But I was just kind of frustrated at our main character the whole time. I wasn't really rooting for her. It was still really good. I gave it 3.5 stars. I probably could be persuaded to go up to 4, but it felt like 3.5 when I finished. But The Kindest Lie by Nancy Johnson, I would still recommend it. My mom really, really liked it. I personally was just a little frustrated at our main character. But The Kindest Lie. Our last fiction is more of a science fiction-y book. So this is Kindred by Octavia Butler. I actually got this book recommended to me when I went to the bookstore, wow, in like December or November. It was snowing, I remember, because I was wearing flip-flops. And one man who was sitting on the street was like, "You're gonna get a cold." And I was like, "Probably, but I can't change now." So it must have been December or so, and I went to the bookstore and I asked the person to recommend me books by authors of color because I knew at that point I wanted to diversify my reading because I was severely lacking in representation. And she recommended Octavia Butler to me since she is a big name in science fiction. This book was so good. I literally just finished it. I started it when I finished work at 5 and it's like 7:30 and I couldn't put it down. It's such a good book. It's about a woman who lives in 1976 with her white husband, and she is connected somehow with a boy who lives in the antebellum South in 1819. So she is trying to live her life, but she keeps getting transported back to this time where slavery was super prevalent, and it's about her trying to survive in both senses. Her trying to survive these crazy things that are now happening to her, and her also trying to survive in the South in the throes of slavery right before the Civil War happened. It was a really, really good book. I'm gonna give it 5 stars. Actually, I like haven't even rated it yet. Like I literally just finished. I'm gonna give it 5 stars. Kindred by Octavia Butler. Next we have some romance books if you're feeling something a little different. So first we have Cinderella is Dead by Kalynn Bayron. I read this last month. It's a young adult fantasy romance with LGBTQIA+ representation. It was good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. But I got this from TikTok and I didn't enjoy it as much as the people on TikTok did. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is young adult and I am not a young adult anymore. It felt slower to me than some of my other fantasy reads, and it also felt a little less intense than what I was expecting. It was still very good. I would definitely recommend it to a young adult fantasy lover in your life. Cinderella is Dead by Kalynn, Bayron. I gave it 3.5 stars, but probably just because I'm not a young adult. Next we have The Wedding Party. This is such a good book by Jasmine Guillory. I loved this book. So this is definitely for sure 5 stars. I also read this last month. My big thing about romances is that they're trying to make the characters relatable, but also likable and human. So I think a lot of people have difficulty writing. I mean, I'm speaking of this like I was so good at it. I literally have never written a book. I'm sure it is very, very difficult to do all 3 of those things, but a lot of people tend to write people so they're either not human, that's not a very realistic portrayal of what a person is like, or they make them ridiculously flawed, or I don't really like them as a person. And really with romance, you want to be rooting for your characters. You don't want to, for any book, you want to be rooting for your characters. If you don't care about what happens to them, you're not going to read the rest of the book. This book was beautiful and realistic, and all of the characters were so lovable, and I am obsessed with this. It was my first 5-star read of the year. 5 stars. The Wedding Party by Jasmine Guillory. Read this. Last but not least, we have Ties That Tether by Igharo. This was a really good book. I picked it up. It was the Book of the Month Club book that my mom gave to me, and months ago, she gave to me a couple months ago, and I just hadn't read it. I hadn't picked it up yet, and I was like, I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna pick it up. I'm gonna do it. And I breezed through this book. It was so good. It was so realistic in that the main character made a major life decision and kind of still flip-flopped back and forth between it. I don't know if that's a spoiler or not, but a lot of times in romance novels, you get to the end and these characters make major life decisions and they're just completely fine with them. And it's ridiculous life decisions too. They're like, you know what, now that you love me, I don't even care that I killed that man. And you're like, should you still care though? A little bit? Or they'll make huge decisions and you're like, have you thought this through though? So this book was realistic in that, I don't want to give too much away because I really want you to read this book. This book was 4.5 stars, it was really good. And I don't want to give too much away, but it was very realistic in how she handled it. It wasn't like she made a decision and that was it. That was the decision she made. She kind of flip-flopped back and forth because the things she decided, or the decisions that she needed to make differed so much from how she'd been taught her whole life that it was more difficult than just choosing something and having that be the way that it is. I really, really like this book. I also really like this book because it's written from the perspective of a first-generation immigrant, and I have never been a first-generation immigrant. I would not know what that feels like, and I'm not saying that this book explained it perfectly, and now I know exactly how it feels to be a first-generation immigrant because 1, the experience is so different for so many people, and 2, I am not that naive to think that one book, any books can describe the way that you feel accurately enough that I could also feel that. And 3, there's no way that I am that empathetic. I am empathetic, but there's no way that I'm that empathetic that I could be like, yeah, I get it now. I get these feelings. So I loved how it gave me insight into that though. She wasn't just like, I'm a first-generation immigrant and it's hard. She was explaining to me throughout the book how being a first-generation immigrant had changed so much of her life and had shaped her life so much, and I thought that was super, super interesting. I didn't really like the twist at the end because even though she flip-flopped back and forth between her decisions and stuff, I feel like it still was such a quick all right, we're good. And I was like, are you? You're good. Just like that. So interesting. But it was still a really good read. 4.5 stars. Ties That Tether by Igharo. So like I said, these are just literally a drop in an ocean of works by people who are typically underrepresented in the book world. And you should not just be reading books by Black authors because it is Black History Month. But if you wanted to diversify your reading a little bit, and you wanted some recommendations. I hope that these helped. I really enjoyed reading them. As I said in my last video, I'm hoping to read 50% of my books from authors of color and underrepresented authors. So this month was a really good start, and last month was a really good start, and I hope to continue to read books by people that are typically underrepresented. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.